Hey students, so in video one we watched this lovely video and listened to its lovely song to help us better understand how cognitive dissonance might occur in our day-to-day lives. So hopefully that kind of just helped wrap up what cognitive dissonance is. And so how do we cope? So when we're experiencing cognitive dissonance, as we discussed in video one, what is it that we do to cope? And so remember we talked about the three ways. So the first way is to change one or more of the attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, etc., to make the relationship between the two elements a consonant one. And so it's the idea that if what we believe and do don't match, maybe we change our beliefs. We also might acquire new information that outweighs the dissonant beliefs. So we might try to prove that whatever caused the dissonance is actually wrong. And so this, for example, thinking smoking causes lung cancer will cause dissonance if a person smokes. However, new information such as research has not proved definitively that smoking causes lung cancer may reduce the dissonance. And so people, when they're feeling cognitive dissonance, might go to the internet and try to seek out sources of comfort, or they might seek out a person who might kind of see it the same way as they do and find a person who agrees with them and makes them feel better. And so those are other ways that we cope with cognitive dissonance. And last but not least, we reduce the importance of the cognitions, the beliefs and attitudes. A person could convince themselves that it's better to live for today than save for tomorrow. In other words, he can tell himself that a short life filled with smoking and sensual pleasure is better than a long life devoid of such joys. And so there are a lot of ways that we deal with cognitive dissonance, but ultimately all of it's rationalization. When it comes down to it, for these examples, smoking is bad for you. And ultimately, you should stop smoking. But for various reasons, people can't or don't want to stop smoking. And so they cope with it in different ways. And that's cognitive dissonance for you. And cognitive dissonance is not alone in our brains. There are many different cognitive biases that exist and go on up here. So for instance, just some other ones that we experience are anchoring bias, availability heuristic, bandwagon effect, blind spot bias, choice supportive bias, clustering illusion, confirmation bias, and conservative bias. I would suggest pausing and looking at these, because when you're reading Slaughterhouse-Five, you're going to see Billy Pilgrim do some of these. And it would be an interesting way to gain an even deeper understanding of the novel. So maybe take a pause and read through these. But for the sake of time in our video, I want to let you do that on your own. So why does our brain make these mistakes? There are so many different forms of cognitive biases. Why does that happen? All right, we're going to talk about why it happens. So first off, what was your reaction to this woman's face? When it popped up on the screen, what did you think? What did you think? So you probably thought something along the lines of, this woman is mad at me. She might be about to yell at me. Why is she so upset? Your thoughts might have been something along those lines. So we combined seeing and intuitive thinking. We saw her face, and in a split second, we were able to detect anger, extend to the future. She's going to yell. She's gonna say something mean. She might curse at me. And this response was automatic and effortless. We didn't have to think hard about it. We just knew this to be the case, and it happened almost instantaneously. Now take a look at this, 17 times 24. Go ahead and solve that in your head. You solve it in your head, I'm gonna solve it on a phone while you solve it in your head. Okay. You can do it, I believe in you. You're almost there. Just think it out, do a little error multiplication. Don't forget to carry the thing. All right, so what is it? So it's 408, apparently. I can't do it. Yeah, so 408 So trying to figure out this multiplication, this is slow thinking. So this is very different from the type of thinking we experienced when we saw the woman's face. So with slow thinking, you had to retrieve from memory how you do multiplication. So you had to, okay, so how do I do this? Then you had to implement the cognitive program. Okay, I'm going to implement it 17 times 24, 4 times 7. And you do all of that. And you have the strain of putting the material into the memory where you multiply the number, but then you have to carry it, and then you have to do this, and you have to keep that all in your head. And this is deliberate. It uses effort, and it's orderly. And so these are very different ways of thinking. So we have system one of thinking, which is intuitive, it's immediate, it's effortless. And then we have system two of thinking, which is deliberate and takes effort and has some kind of order to it. And so system two, ultimately because of how it works, requires attention. And so because it requires attention, that means that we can be disrupted by distractions. If I'm trying to multiply 17 by 24 in my head and my dog starts barking, I'm going to be like, no, stop barking, stop barking. And I'm going to get distracted from the thought process I was trying to do. And so it requires self-control. And when you have to control your brain and make it focus, you have a limited budget of energy to do that. That's why when we're doing all of these Zoom classes, your early Zoom classes probably feel a little easier than your later Zoom classes. By the time you reach that fourth period Zoom class, this limited budget of system two thinking is getting kind of low. Your energy is getting low and you're having trouble self-controlling this more kind of deliberate and taxing thought process. And so that's what you're experiencing during that time. And so when we watched the invisible gorilla video, that's what was occurring there. So I asked for you to use your system two thought processes, and I asked for you to count the number of times that the basketball was passed. And so there was a lot of movement. You were trying to count it. There was music as well. The video was a little bit dim, and so you really had to focus. And because you were focusing so hard, you might have missed the dancing bear in that case. As I mentioned before, the original experiment was done with a dancing invisible gorilla. And so you might have missed him because your system two was so focused and draining your ability to see other things. And so this brings us to this quote: we can be blind of the obvious, and we are also blind to our blindnesses. And so it's the idea that that dancing bear should have been obvious, but a lot of people don't see it. And so it's the idea that we were blind to it being there, even though it was there. And had someone not told you at the end of the video that there was a dancing bear, you would have never known. You would have never known that there had been a dancing bear, and you would have gone on none the wiser. And so the question is, in our daily lives, what are the blindnesses that we don't even realize we're blind to? What are the things that we do, we say, that happen around us that we don't realize at all? And so that's essentially what the invisible gorilla, or in our case, the invisible bear, is kind of getting at. And so with the self-control test, with system two, with the idea that that kind of ability of thinking can get exhausted over time, this is a little self-control test where you can practice it. And so what you're supposed to do is, for this one, you're supposed to say whether the word is on the left or the right. And so you go down and you should say left or right depending on where the word is located. So go ahead and try it. All right. So for instance, you might have this, what you should have said is left, right, left, left, right, right, left, right. And whew, I did it. And so this gets harder the more tired you are. And then here you do it with this one, where you should say whether it's uppercase or lowercase based upon whether it's uppercase or actually lowercase. So go ahead and give it a try. And so what you should have said is lowercase, lowercase, uppercase, lowercase, uppercase, lowercase, uppercase, lowercase. Well, I almost messed up there. I could feel myself almost mess up. And so it's the idea that this is difficult because we have programmed memory and we have a competing response that causes strain. And so what we want to do is we want to read the word. So we want to say left, left. But what we have been asked to say is left, right. But there's a conflict here where this says left, but it is right. And so we have two opposing forces in our brain. And so that creates conflict. And when we have a programmed memory that's in conflict, that causes strain and it drains our energy. And over time, we can't perform as well as we maybe initially did. And that's what System 2 thinking does. Throughout the day, the more we use System 2 prior to going to sleep, sleeping is kind of a reset, our brains get more and more tired and it's harder to do this kind of thinking. And so we have a conflict between a task that you intended to carry out and an automatic response that interferes with it. So we have an intended task here, but it conflicts with an automatic response. And that conflict causes strain. And so for instance, let's take a look here. So we have these illusions. And so if I asked which line is longer, this line or this line, you've probably done these before. We know that they're actually the same exact length, but when you look at it, this line looks longer. And so we've been tasked with this idea of measuring the lines. You're like, it's the same length, but our automatic response says, this one's longer. And so we have the conflict and that bothers our brain. It doesn't seem right. Same with here. We ask, is this line longer or this line longer? Our automatic response is going to be, well, this one is longer. But if we actually measure it and complete the process, we find that they are the same length and there's a conflict there. But this again shows the fact that like our brain can be deceived unless we pay special attention to make sure that we're not letting the deception occur. And the thing is, if you go through your entire day saying, I want to make sure I'm not deceived, I want to make sure I see everything that's happening, that I'm acting in the right way, after a while, we're just going to be so exhausted that we can't keep that up. And that's System 2 thinking. And so we have this competition between seeing and knowing, or seeing and knowing. So with System 1, we see something and we just assume that we know the answer. But with System 2, we actually go through a thought process and we come to more reliable conclusions. So ideally, we would go through our day with System 2 thinking. But as I just mentioned before, if we did that, we would reach sheer exhaustion. We wouldn't be able to make it through the entire day. We have to rely some on our System 1 thinking in order to get by. And so the danger is that you need to learn to mistrust your impressions, because the reasons why we have so many cognitive biases is because we rely too much on System 1, but it's also about a balance. If we try to eliminate all cognitive biases by always making sure we practice System 2, like I said, we would be too exhausted. And so why is this so important? So I think this is the very last slide, and I think it's a good way to kind of end it to show that this actually is quite relevant. So let's consider the Hungry Judge report. And so this was a study, and it found a disturbing demonstration of depletion effect. So depletion effect is the idea that our System 2, our ability to think with System 2 gets depleted over time. In judgment was recently reported in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. The unwitting participants in the study were 8 parole judges in Israel. They spend entire days reviewing applications for parole. The cases are presented in random order, and the judges spend little time on each one, the average of 6 minutes. The default decision is denial of parole. Only 35% of requests are approved. The exact time of each decision is recorded, and the times of the judges' 3 food breaks, morning break, lunch, and afternoon break, during the day are recorded as well. The authors of the study plotted the proportion of approved requests against the time since the last food break. The proportion spikes after each meal, when about 65% of the requests are granted. During the 2 hours or so until the judge's next feeding, the approval rate drops steadily to about 0 just before the meal. So I want to finish this video by asking you to think about the consequences of this reality. All right, bye.